We've seen the transformation of small hunter-gatherer bands into larger villages of agriculturalists, and how within agricultural communities we can see the emergence of social inequality. We looked at the examples of woodland transformation into the Mississippian period and changes between the pre-classic and classic period Hohokam. But another level of change is the transition to complex societies, or states. These are societies that have social and economic differentiation. And complex societies arose independently in different parts of the world. And so the question is, what factors led to these changes? How did egalitarian societies transform into ones with institutional inequalities? And how did these institutions that created inequalities become self-sustaining and self-reinforcing to make these inequalities permanent? How were people convinced to give up their freedoms and accept restrictions on their social, political, and economic lives? States are societies that are characterized by economies that have a complex division of labor and high levels of task specialization. States also have systems of writing and record-keeping to organize and manage this more complex economic system. In states, authority is centralized and is created and maintained by ideology and supported by bureaucratic institutions. In early states, most leadership roles are inherited, and the authority of rulers can be delegated to various institutions. Bureaucratic institutions filled with various functionaries that perform different tasks to process and manage information for the rulers. And in these institutions, it is the institution itself that is important, not the various individuals that fill the roles. They are all replaceable, but the institution lives on and maintains its power. States control religion in order to sanctify the authority of the rulers. Rulers have this position of power often because they're believed to have some divine descent from the gods or from culture heroes that founded the society. And the inequality of the established social order is justified on the basis of this descent from the supernatural, and it is validated and reinforced by this association with supernatural powers. In states, the right to use force is monopolized as a state power. In smaller scale bands and tribes, individual kin groups have the right to use force against others who they may feel have transgressed upon them. If a member of their group was killed, assaulted, raped by someone from another group, they could seek justice through their own application of force and violence. But in states, the right to use force is a state power. No citizens within the state are allowed to use force against other citizens. It is something that is only exercised by a professional military or police class within the state. And you have full-time professionals in these tasks operating to enforce state power and assure order within the community. Economic production and distribution is largely controlled by the state. And you have different classes. You have an elite class of the rulers and their functionaries who direct economic activity. A middle class of craft workers, bureaucrats and other managers, and the military. People whose interests have been attached to the elite class. The benefits that they have been able to accrue is because of the system that the elite class rules over. And they will do whatever they can to support this system that provides benefits to them. And then you have a lower class, the broad foundation of peasant farmers who work land to produce food to feed everyone. But they are not working land that they own themselves anymore. They're often working land that is owned by elite landlords, and they produce for the state system of food redistribution. They pay a portion of their produce as tribute to their landlords and also to the state. And this tribute is cycled upwards to the top, where it can be controlled and used to finance elite activities, but it can also be used to finance state activities, construction activities of various forms of infrastructure, and also to fund communal ritual, sort of a tax return, where the contributed tribute can be paid back to the people in order to thank them for their allegiance and acceptance of the system. The underlying causes that led to the emergence of complex societies can vary greatly. There's the role of both integrative forces, forces that bring people together voluntarily because they see that a rising tide floats all boats, and there are also coercive forces, where they are required to participate, maybe not because it benefits them, but because it benefits another segment of the community. Such institutions emerge in consensus with larger, denser populations. As populations grow and communities become larger, consensual methods of decision-making that we see in smaller-scale societies simply do not work as effectively, and you need to develop a new system of management of people who specialize in these managerial tasks in order to bring the larger communities together to operate efficiently. These institutions become self-serving, so that those who have privileges remain privileged and are able to pass those privileges on to their descendants. We see a positive feedback cycle as the accumulation of resources in the upper class allows them to further consolidate their power, and once they've consolidated power, they can accumulate more resources in order to consolidate more power. So these positive feedback cycles encourage the consolidation of power, but also encourage further specialization on an economic scale, specialization on a managerial scale, and also encourage further growth. And more growth means more management and more powerful institutions. The rise of complex societies is usually found linked with changes in exchange and production that lead to new economic relationships and the need for new institutions to manage them. V. Gordon Childe was an Australian archaeologist who was instrumental in understanding the emergence of early cities in Mesopotamia. And he developed a voluntaristic theory of state formation. Childe was a dyed-in-the-wool socialist and believed very strongly in the positive benefits of social cooperation. And he believed that the development of intensive agriculture created food surpluses, and that these food surpluses would allow different segments of the community to engage in new occupations. Not everyone needs to be a farmer or a herder. People can work in craft production as weavers, or they can be potters, or they may engage in managing the exchange of these resources as traders. The creation of these different specialized segments of the community with different productive tasks requires political integration in order to mediate between these different interest groups and provide an economic superstructure that allows the exchange of resources between different segments of the community. And Childe believed that people would voluntarily participate in this because a rising tide floats all boats. It assists everyone. This may be a fairly rosy perspective on human nature, and we'll see some others that are decidedly more pessimistic in just a minute. Archaeologist Carl Wittfogel, who worked in northern China and Mesopotamia, believed that irrigation and the consolidation of irrigation systems led to the creation of a centralized political authority with coercive power. That small-scale irrigation farmers in arid areas could see the economic advantage to merging their small communities into a larger political entity, allowing them to put their small irrigation systems together into larger irrigation systems that could more efficiently and effectively use the available water and allocate it among users also creating larger areas under production, increasing the productive capability of these irrigation systems. So the development and maintenance of these large-scale irrigation systems would require more centralized authority to manage these larger populations, to manage these larger systems, in order to allocate labor for construction and maintenance purposes, and also to equally allocate water among all of the users. So it leads to the creation of new levels of managerial authority, and these new levels would come to extend their control over other aspects of the economy and society. Robert Carniero, who worked in South America, suggested that the existence of the state is directly the result of political competition between communities for control of resources. And they're not just controlling physical resources like land and the resources that could be extracted from the land, but people, their labor, and their productive potential. Competition between communities in order to control a larger resource base would lead to conflict, particularly as communities grew in size and began to fill up all of the open spaces between them, leading to increasing competition to define boundaries between communities. This competition invariably would lead to conflict, the emergence of warfare, and a need for centralized authority in order to manage conflict, to determine when offensive or defensive acts would be taken, to organize and prepare for offensive and defensive actions, and also to engage in peacemaking. The centralized authorities and conflict would define boundaries between peer polities that were considered relatively equal, but there are often polities that consider themselves more equal than others. Some attempt to subjugate one another in order to expropriate those resources, to take control of their territory, and the resources that can be extracted from them, the people that live within that territory, their productive capacity, and their labor. So Carniero sees the emergence of states not as some cooperative effort, as Childs saw, but rather it is through the application of coercive force. Building on Carniero's idea of the importance of coercive force, sociologist Charles Tilly has suggested we really need to re-examine the emergence of states. And when we re-examine it, we need to recognize that early states were very different from the modern states that we live in. In early states, the consent of the governed was limited. In our modern democratic society, the power and authority of governmental institutions arises because of the consent of the citizens to allow these institutions to exist. In early states, the lower levels of populations really had limited ability to influence the rulers, and their consent, their desire to be subjected to these rules, was not necessarily a concern of these emergent rulers. In early states, the benefits of state organization largely flowed upwards and accumulated to the ruling class, and didn't benefit as much, if at all, the lower class of peasant producers that were necessary for the production of the goods that were required to finance a state. And the resources that were collected by state institutions were invested in order to benefit the ruling class. Early states did not have the same investment in infrastructure that modern states have. So think of the investments that our tax dollars go into various forms of infrastructure that benefit the entire community. Think of roads in particular, and how these roads are made in order to assist the movement of goods and services throughout a community, to allow people to get from one place to the other easily and engage in economic activity. But they are largely made to benefit the entire community, whereas similar capital investments in early states were largely done just to benefit the ruling class. Tilley suggests that early states need to be seen as analogous to protection and extortion rackets. That early states benefit an emerging elite by protecting their economic activity and capital investments, allowing them to continue to reap the benefits from these while exploiting those at the bottom. And those at the bottom are extorted of tribute and taxes, either through direct or indirect threats of violence and promises of protection. It's sort of like you've got a small community with a nice agricultural land base and a nice little irrigation system that benefits them all, and all of a sudden this horde of barbarians shows up on the horizon. The leader tells them, "Wow, this is a beautiful valley you got here. It'd be a real shame if something happened to it. It'd be real terrible if a bunch of barbarians like these guys behind me just came rampaging through. Tell you what, we can protect you from them." You may be thinking, "Wow, that sounds like the mob and a shakedown racket. It'd be terrible if your window got smashed. You better pay some protection." And Tilley suggests that early states were very similar to this in terms of the way that they used the threat of violence and promises of protection from disorder to create and reinforce their power. And the institutions of the state were used to reinforce elite power, to benefit those at the top, and there was very limited benefit for those at the bottom. Archaeologists Alan Johnson and Timothy Earle suggest that you actually have to have many different things coming into alignment in order to allow for the emergence of initial state formation. The first thing is you have to have a high population density that is reaching the limits of the ability for them to produce for themselves. It requires a need for a system of integration to facilitate economic and political activity. And there must be the possibility of controlling the economy, because with economic control, it allows the financing of institutions that will be used to support a ruling class. And Johnson and Earle suggest that there could be different situations that could lead to these three possibilities of aligning and allowing the emergence of states. There may be several pathways to power, several different ways that power can be consolidated and reinforced and replicated generation after generation to create a ruling class that has greater access to wealth and power than the remainder of the community. So think, what are some ways that power can be consolidated and reinforced? The three primary means to consolidating and reinforcing power is through control of the economy, controlling the production and distribution of goods. And by controlling the production and distribution, an emergent ruling class is able to accrue the benefits to themselves. Another pathway to power, often used in conjunction with control of the economy, is control of the military, the ability to use might and intimidation to get your way, to reinforce your control of resources, your control of people and their labor. And finally, the use of ideology to validate and justify these levels of control. Ideology is an explanation of the way the world works, the way the universe and the political systems, social and economic systems in them, how do they work? How do we justify the nature of their operation? And ideology is often expressed through political statements or religious statements that justify the natural order, and in this case, a natural order of emerging inequality, a natural order where a small segment of the community has greater access to wealth and power, and has a means of reinforcing their control of wealth and power. We'll now look at two case studies of the emergence of states in the Americas to compare and contrast this process in two areas. We will look at coastal South America, which is one of the driest deserts in the world. But rain and snow that fell in the Andes Mountains flowed through rivers through this arid desert, providing the potential for irrigation agriculture. And in contrast, we'll look at the Gulf Coast in Mesoamerica. It's not a dry desert. Instead, it is a very lush tropical rainforest, highly productive. But there are other limitations on resources there. And we'll see how there are differences in the environment and how these differences in the environment influence different pathways that were used to create and maintain power.